You know that feeling, right? That constant pressure. Work, bills, just life. It can feel like you're drowning in it sometimes. But have you ever stopped to wonder, does this ever let up? I mean, does stress actually get better as we get older?
All right, let's just dive right in with a number. And fair warning, it's kind of a gut punch, but it really puts the scale of modern stress into perspective.
Yeah, 48%. That's right. According to a recent report from the US Surgeon General, nearly half of all parents say that on most days, their stress is just completely overwhelming. And here's where it gets really telling. You see that contrast? The report found that 48% of parents feel overwhelmed, compared to just 26% of other adults. And get this, when asked if they're so stressed they can't even function, a staggering 41% of parents said yes. For other adults, that number was only 20%. I mean, that is a huge, huge gap. So you look at numbers like that, and it's easy to feel a little hopeless, right? Is this just how life works? Is this the deal? We take on more and the stress just keeps piling up forever? But what if that's not the whole story? What if our relationship with stress isn't just this one-way street to burnout? Well, it turns out there's this fascinating landmark study from the National Institutes of Health. They followed thousands of adults for over 20 years, and what they found suggests something completely different. It's a much more hopeful and honestly a way more interesting picture. Okay, so to really get what they found, we got to break stress down into two key ideas. The first one is what they call stressor exposure. It sounds fancy, but it's super straightforward. It's just the number of stressful things that happen to you. You know, an argument, a deadline at work, your kid getting sick, all that stuff. And this is where the good news starts. The NIH study found something crystal clear. As you can see in this quote from the study, the number of stressful events we have to deal with, our stressor exposure, it actually goes down as we get older. It's simple. We just run into fewer of them. Okay, so fewer stressors. That's great, right? But that's only half the puzzle. What about how we feel when stressful stuff does happen? And that brings us to the second big idea, stressor reactivity. This isn't about what happens to you. It's about how much it gets to you. It's the emotional punch it packs. And this, to me, is where the research gets really powerful. Because think about it. If we have fewer stressors, but they still hit us like a ton of bricks, we're not really any better off, are we? But that is not what the data shows. Just look at this number. 47%. Over the 20 years of the study, the youngest group of adults saw their reactivity to stress, remember, that's the emotional punch, it dropped by a staggering 47%. So let that sink in. Not only do we face fewer stressors as we get older, but the ones that do pop up, well, they just bother us a whole lot less. I mean, this is a massive shift in how we think about stress. It suggests we're not just victims of it, we actually get better at handling it. But that leads to the big question, right? Why? What is going on inside of us that makes this happen? Well, the answer, it turns out, is deep inside our brains. So to get why, we need to meet two key players in your brain's stress response. First up, you've got the amygdala. You can just think of it as the alarm. It's that primitive, super fast part of your brain that just screams danger. Then you've got the prefrontal cortex. Let's call this one the manager. This is the more evolved, rational part that can step in and say, whoa, hang on, let's calm down and figure this out. Okay, so check this out. A study in Neuroimage Clinical shows how the relationship between these two parts of the brain totally changes as we grow up. And this is the why. In teenagers, when stress is high, the connection between them gets stronger. The alarm is basically just shouting at the manager, nonstop. But look what happens when we become young adults. The whole thing flips. More stress is now linked to a weaker connection. It's like the manager is finally getting better at turning down the volume on the alarm. Here's another way to think about it. In a teenage brain, the connection is basically a one-way street. It's all bottom up. The alarm is yelling orders at the manager. But as we get older, that street becomes a two-way conversation. The manager can actually talk back to the alarm. Calm it down, regulate the whole response. Our brain's stress circuit literally gets a fundamental upgrade. Okay, so let's circle all the way back to where we started, to that 48% of parents who feel completely overwhelmed. Look, they are not imagining this. The Surgeon General's report lists out the intense, real-world stuff they're dealing with every single day. Crushing financial strain, the endless second shift of taking care of the kids, worrying about their safety, their mental health, not to mention feeling isolated and dealing with all the pressure from social media. So yeah, the demands of modern life, especially for parents, they're intense, no question. The stressor exposure is off the charts. But here's the beautiful takeaway from everything we've looked at. Even while the world is throwing all this stuff at us, our brains are quietly doing their own thing. They're changing, maturing, and literally building the tools we need to handle it all. The manager is getting better at having that conversation with the alarm. And that's really the core idea here. A relationship with stress isn't some fixed life sentence. It's a dynamic, changing thing. The person you are at 45 is just not the same person you were at 25. Your brain matures. Your ability to handle your emotions gets better. We adapt. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Look, knowing all this doesn't make today's stress just magically vanish. It doesn't work like that. But knowing that your brain is literally built to get better at this, that you are biologically designed to adapt and mature through these challenges, how might that change how you look at the pressure you're feeling right now?